Welcome back to Stump the Monk. Today we're going to have a conversation with my good friend and academic powerhouse, Dr. Natalie Quli, who's a professor at the Institute for Buddhist Studies, which is this wonderful Buddhist institution of higher learning in Berkeley, California. But before we do that, let's have questions.
What is your definition of cultural appropriation?
I think that if we want to understand cultural appropriation, it has to do with who profits from production of cultural artifacts. So if we're talking about, and the question always is the person profiting part of the culture from which they're producing artifacts? So, the big thing is the native headdresses, and who gets to profit off of indigenous people's spirituality and those kinds of things, or African culture or African American culture, and who gets to profit off of that, right? Because all of our cultures make cultural artifacts, right? We all have a culture. And so the question about appropriation has to do with who is producing and who's profiting.
Is having community around your spirituality important?
I think it's everything. But at the same time, it's a pretty broad definition. I don't live in a community anymore, and I don't have a center, and so my definition of community is much different than, say, somebody who lives at a center or is a monastic living in community. So I think that, I think community is vital, and having spiritual friends are vital, and having people who hold me accountable is vital, particularly because the work I do is in this area around white supremacy and around patriarchy, and undoing those things. I need to be in community with people who hold me accountable to the things I say or the things I do, particularly people from communities of color, but also women and all of these things, right? So, and just in Buddhism, right? So it said that the Buddha at one point was said to Ananda, what is the whole? Buddha is said to have said to his attendant that spiritual friendship, deep friendships, or community is the whole of the holy life, meaning that's what makes people holy. And I think that that's a really good way to look at it, right? Because I think as human beings, we don't function well when we're not in community. I think that's what makes this quarantine, this period of separation, physical distancing, so difficult. Is we are social animals. We are best when we're in community with each other, and we're having to find new ways to be in community. We're having to find, I live alone, and so I'll go days without actually seeing or speaking to another person. And so I've had to find ways to be in community that are different now because of this pandemic. And so I think community is vital, not just for spiritual people, but for everybody. And figuring out where is my community? Who are my people? Where are my people? And what's my relationship to those people, right? Is really important. And I think doesn't actually get talked about enough in a capitalist society where we're focused on production and, all of the things that we're focused on. The need for us to connect deeply with other people is, I think, is the whole reason to be alive, honestly. So, hi everybody, and welcome to Stump the Monk in Quarantine. Our lovely guest today is my friend and an old professor of mine from the Institute for Buddhist Studies, Dr. Natalie Quli, who is the professor of Buddhist modernism and contemporary Theravadan studies. Most of her academic work that I'm really drawn to has to do with the relationship of Buddhism and its modern sort of iteration and the way that it intersects with social justice causes and things like the patriarchy and white supremacy and all of those things. So I'm very excited we're having this conversation today. And so is there anything else you'd like to add about your work or?
Not in particular. I think these days I'm really trying to shine a light on the way that academic representations affect the groups of that they are representing and also flow into other groups who take them up and use them in their own ways. So right. I'm definitely into post-colonial scholarship at this point. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. We can just chat some more and talk more on that.
So, and I also want to point out that you're sort of also a practitioner as well. You're not just academic.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been doing some research on this today, actually. I identify as a practitioner because I think that my scholarship is problematized by my subjectivities, right?
So yeah.
While I try to do my scholarship mainly from the methodological program of social scientific studies of religion, I would be remiss if I didn't also identify that I have personal commitments, right? My scholarship, I think I try as much as I can to sideline my own religious identity, but I know that it intersects. So it's important, I think, just to be out with it, be forward with it.
Right.
At the same time, I resist the Buddhist identity. So it's really problematizing for me because I come from an atheist, non-religious household and family. And I tend to have a very critical eye towards religious institutions and structures. And so identifying as Buddhist, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can do that. But at the same time, just studying it,
right.
That being like you can't, where's the point at which I'm not Buddhist and where's the point at which I am Buddhist? I don't know where that line is. So
right.
I'm hanging out there.
Well, and what's interesting about that is I think that we all have subjectivity.
Yeah.
There's two things that came up for me. One was we all have subjectivity. I mean, we're all involved in this sort of soup. And part of what I think contributes to white supremacy and its expression inside of institutions and patriarchy inside of institutions is our unwillingness to own our own subjectivity.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Like I wanna rise above my subjectivity. And we even talk about it in moments of cultural stuff. I was watching the Prince thing this weekend.
For Prince's, in honor of Prince and his passing, yeah.
And I remember when he died and people wanting to claim he rose above race or worked outside of race. And I thought, what a really interesting thing, because so much of what I see as what made him him was his race and his racial expression and his place within that. And so that was one thing, this idea of owning our own subjectivity. And the other thing I want to say is I want to ask about is part of the problematizing, because I have a problem with the Buddhist identity too, but it has more to do with I'm so disappointed in so many Buddhist institutions.
Yeah.
And there's so much that is happening in Buddhist institutions that is harmful or difficult for so many people I love and care about. So I think that also sort of adds a layer onto this identity piece. And so I think owning it and claiming it and sort of expressing it is really helpful. And speaking of that, let's go into, you just did a piece on the Institute for Buddhist Studies blog about cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
And the ways in which, the question was, you know, whether or not Buddhism is by its nature culturally appropriating.
Right.
And can you maybe say some things about that? And
I could say some things about that. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about Buddhism in the West as cultural appropriation. And I think the very first thing we have to talk about is that, who do we mean by Buddhism in the West? The second we say Buddhism in the West, who are we talking about? So is Japanese American Jodo Shinshu appropriating Buddhism? No. Is it changing in its Western context as being practiced by Westerners in the United States who are of Japanese American ancestry and others? Yeah, it's changing. So we've got to be really upfront and center about who we're talking about with cultural appropriation. So I think one of the issues that comes up when we talk about cultural appropriation, and I think part of it is just inbuilt in the terminology we use of the term appropriation, is that we want to talk about who owns, like, well, then who owns Buddhism? Who owns the right to represent? I think that answer is a lot, in some ways, it's a lot simpler when we're talking about communities that do not have universalist claims in their religious beliefs. Like, if we're talking about, you know, Navajo religion, it's for Navajo people. It's never been like articulated as being a universal religion for everyone. It's for the Nada-Ne. It's for these people. It's for us. But Buddhism claims to be for everyone, right? So when we talk about stealing, we've got to take that into account. Like, that's got to be there. So for me, I think the more nuanced way of talking about this isn't stealing, because practicing Buddhism as it moves from culture to culture has happened for the last 2,600 years. That's what it does. That's what the Buddhist traditions do. They move into new areas. People infuse them with local variants. They take some things out, they put some things in. That's how Buddhism lives. That's how it's a lived religion. Now, what we're talking about here is, and mainly I'm talking about the United States context, is the way that some Buddhist groups of converts in particular claim to be cleansed. And that's really the issue. It's so much that they're claiming a Buddhist identity because, of course, practice Buddhism. Like, of course you can be a Buddhist. Like, of course. But the idea is this, that there's, in many white converts, there is the assumption, unspoken and unacknowledged, that the way I do it will be better because I'm more scientific, I'm more intelligent, I'm more educated, and I am going to cleanse it and purify it back to its original form or back to its better form, with the assumption being that the particularities that are being cleansed aren't modern, right? So,
or they're just cultural. They're not.
Or they're just cultural.
Buddhism.
Right. I think if you start to dig into that, when they talk about the claim is that what we're doing isn't cultural, right? That's cultural Buddhism. This is modern Buddhism. That's what the archaeology of it usually reveals, right?
Right.
It's this universalist claim to represent the modern, and that goes with essentializing, Asian populations as being backward. Like, those dualities arise together, and they're often unspoken.
Right.
So now we're getting into some of the thornier issues. The issue, again, isn't innovation. Innovation always happens in Buddhism as somebody takes up Buddhist practices and embodies them. It's just going to happen. The question is, how are your articulations about Buddhist practice and authenticating discourse, how does that affect other people? How
Right.
does it affect other people? And this isn't an issue of me as a Buddhist trying to tell other people what authentic Buddhism is. I have no idea what authentic Buddhism is. I don't even, honestly, I don't even think there is an authentic Buddhist, or an authentic Buddhism for that matter. It's not about coming from a position of authenticity. Is this real Buddhism? And therefore, is this under the ownership of these people? The question is, how are my characterizations impacting other people? That's not an issue of Buddhist identity. That's a scholarly issue as much as anything, because scholars are embedded in systems of power.
Right.
And that's why I'm forthright about Buddhist identity, about being white, about where I'm drawn in the web of relations, because it matters.
Right. And do you think it's also impacted by the lack of awareness, often by white convert Buddhists, to understand the role of colonialism and the role of white supremacy in the Buddhism that they even were exposed to? I mean, I remember reading a book by Joseph Chia about the way that before, you know, the early people from the West went to India, you know, Salzburg and Cornfield and all of them.
Yeah.
By the time they even got exposed to Buddhism in places like Sri Lanka and Myanmar and all those places, they had already been exposed. The Buddhism they were exposed to was already steeped in white supremacy,
Right.
and colonialism. And so without any acknowledgement, what they brought back is already...
Right. They went seeking this orientalized version of Buddhism, and they found it, and then claimed that that was the original.
Right.
The original. What they found was the product of a century ago that infused it with particular values, right?
Right.
Then they found those values a century later, and we're like, whoa, we've discovered it.
Right. and I think that we have a really interesting relationship then to what happens is we end up in this conflicted relationship with particular Asian ethnicities around the expression of Buddhism. Like on one hand, we make them backwards and it's all cultural, but on the other hand, we exotify them.
Yeah.
And then put them up on these, you know, magical pedestals, which then...
And then you get abuse.
Exactly. And so the ways in which the patriarchal abuse that we're seeing happen is in this dual relationship of not owning white supremacy and colonialism in our expression.
Yeah.
And not even owning that, oh my gosh, I already mark the Buddhism that I practice as culturally separate from me, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I practice an Americanized form of Japanese Buddhism. That's what I was trained in. And it's an alive question for me when I'm talking about Zen in my life, to recognize that I sit in a particular location and to not exotify other people's location.
Yeah.
But also not diminish it, right? You know, it's certainly...
Well, that's relating to people as humans, right? That's
exactly.
relating to people as humans instead of as stereotypes. So I want to point out there's more than one approach to the texts themselves. They are multivocal, like you say. They're embedded in lots of different contexts. Some of them are, you know, redactions that occurred later. I think this is one of those cases where, you know, people want to... There's basically two approaches that are being taken. There's one that says Asian traditions are irredeemably patriarchal, and we need to leave them, utterly abandon them, and start something new. And then obviously there's also the idea that, no, we need to work within these, and these are fine, let's do this. There's another position that I see, which is to work within communities to change patriarchal structures. I think the first attitude is what I see the most in particularly white-dominated contexts, because there's not the understanding that patriarchy isn't something that exists elsewhere.
Right.
Patriarchy is something that exists in the system in which I am embedded, and I don't have a neutral stance. And I am also enacting systems of patriarchy. So we're just doing them in different ways. We're doing them in American cultural ways instead of in Indian cultural ways, or like
Sri Lankan cultural ways.
Exactly, right? So we're still working with patriarchy, but now we're working with patriarchy in ways that are less visible to us. So that's problematic. That said, I would like to see more and more recognition that the Bhikkhuni movement has actually come out of a cooperation between so-called tradition and innovation, that it's been both. It's been people collaborating.
Right.
In particular, I want to mention Asian American bhikkhus who have been instrumental in the Bhikkhuni movement, because they're so often maligned in white convert rhetoric as irredeemably patriarchal. And there are irredeemably patriarchal men in Buddhist traditions, including white ones. But there are also plenty of wonderful men in all of these traditions. The idea is, well, do you want to do the hard work of being a racial minority, or do you want to get out of that context completely and start from scratch? I think the Bhikkhuni movement has shown that it can hold on to both of those tensions at the same time.
Well, and what I really appreciate, both in learning from you and also from the work of Paula Arai, about going back to listening to what women have to say about their own practice and about liberation and about how they're working, right? Like you look at what the Japanese Soto Zen nuns have to say about overcoming patriarchy and becoming part of the system and working within the system, but at the same time, they weren't fighting patriarchy. They were just practicing the way that they thought was appropriate. And eventually the men kind of popped up and went, oh yeah, that's what's happening, right? Like, and I think you're right. There is this conversation that's happening between innovation and tradition that I think as white people particularly, we have to also understand the ways in which, as a white male, right? Let's just own that. As a white man, I have to understand the way that patriarchy is so embedded in my socialization and my understanding of the world that I have to start from that place of like, oh yeah, I'm a white male. And so white supremacist patriarchal capitalism is my, from the US. So that's gonna be the lens that I have to kind of.
And if I could say, I want to reiterate this, that is the difference between assuming a universalist narrative that I am just a representative of pureness, of a plate, versus owning our culture. White people have been taught that we have no culture, but we do.
Right.
We do have culture. And you're just articulating what your culture is. It's much easier to not articulate your culture, because then you don't have responsibility for making changes when there's wrong. One of the things I think we need to abandon is trying to identify authentic Buddhism, because the most frequent white fragile response I get is that I am too authentic. I am authentic. This is, you're telling me I'm not authentic. I am an authentic practitioner. And I think we need to get beyond seeing having culturally ingrained white supremacy, meaning that you can't be an authentic Buddhist. You are an authentic Buddhist. Yes, you are. And your practices are authentic. And meditation as a central part of a Buddhist practice is Buddhist. This too. Instead of saying just this or just that, we need to say this too, this too, this. These are all ways of being Buddhist. And it doesn't need to be like, oh, you know, Buddhism in Thailand is more authentically Buddhist.
Right.
Buddhism in Woodacre.
Right.
I believe that to be true. I think they're all Buddhist. They're
Right.
all expressions of Buddhism.
And it's all authentic.
It's all authentic.
And it's all deep.
And it's all filling human needs.
Exactly.
Adjusting to the suffering in the world in ways that are deemed most skillful, you know?
Well, I think for me, it all comes down to the fundamental question in my life always is, am I being more or less an asshole?
That's a good question, isn't it?
Right? Like,
Yeah.
are the things that I'm doing helping me not be such an asshole? Because I, by default, am grumpy and, you know, and
I'm feeling that. I'm feeling that myself. Yeah.
And judgmental and whiny and, you know, all of these things that just make me an asshole, so that I'm walking down the street or, you know, yelling at people on the sidewalk who don't have masks on, and, you know, like all of these things. And so fundamentally at its core, I have to ask myself the question, am I being less of an asshole today than I was yesterday?
Yeah.
Or if I am being an asshole, can I maybe catch myself sooner and go, oh wait, no, that's not, I don't want to be that, right? Like, I really don't want to yell at this person. Like, there's no need. I'm not their parent, you know, like,
yeah,
I can walk away, you know?
Yeah.
And I think fundamentally that's whatever we're doing in our life, could we maybe just work on not being such an asshole?
That is a really great place to start. That is a really, and to end. I mean, that's it.
Right.
That's the practice. That's it.
And if we can do that, and it doesn't matter what gets me there, right? Like if it's merit practice and you know, showing up on, you know, a couple times a week at a temple and, you know, supporting the monks and cleaning the altar or whatever, like, it doesn't matter what gets me to being less of an asshole.
Right. Right.
You know, I know lots of people who have sat lots of meditation for long years who are still total assholes.
Yeah.
I do not want them in my life. And I know lots of people who have meditated for just, you know, 6 months or a year who, like, are so much better at not being jerks in the world. And I look at them and I just think, oh yeah, that's how, like, oh yeah, I want to be that. I want to not be, you know, and I like, oh yeah, that's how I do that.
Boy, it's a challenge. And I tell you, you know, especially in this environment, that's a big challenge for me because, you know, I think exactly no one who has been looking at issues of inequity is surprised by what's gone on in the US in this pandemic. Like, these were the things we expected, right? Like, and that alone, like, I feel frustrated and angry a lot of the time because I'm like, we've been warned. Like, our healthcare system is not, it's not built for caring for people. It's not for that. And
that disproportionately Black and brown bodies are not respected or treated fairly.
Yeah. So are we surprised to see that East Oakland is having higher coronavirus statistics than, you know, Woodacre?
Right.
You know, like, are we really surprised by that? I'm not. So that's a source of real frustration. And not just that, but like seeing, you know, then having all of this uncertainty. I have kids. I'm with my kids all day, every day now. I love them, and it's been a wonderful part of the quarantine is deepening my relationship with my kids. I can't tell you how much it means to me, but at the same time, it's very tiring.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm frustrated with so much of the inequity I see in the world. But I'm tired, and that makes it hard for me to work on these things without being an asshole.
Right.
And as soon as I start being an asshole, I'm not doing the work anymore.
Right.
That's my ego. And so I've come full circle to what I was talking about. I don't know how long ago it was, which is that I was been trying to engage on responses to that article I wrote, and I'm finding myself just being an asshole.
Mm-hmm.
So like the gift of this moment to me and the frustration of it is being able to hold all of this anxiety, all of this grief, and fear, and all of it, and still engage people in ways that are going to lessen pain in the world.
Right.
And I think that's a real challenge for people who are doing social justice work all the time,
Right.
but particularly with the circumstances now, where people are exhausted and they don't have jobs, and they're caring for sick and dying people in their life, and they're being exploited financially.
I have a really wonderful friend who their PhD dissertation was an autoethnographic study of the medical industrial complex and its policing of trans bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to do with their experience of being a data point in the gender clinic at UCLA in the 70s when they were a child.
Ah.
And so what they did though, so a lot of people were like, once they got their doctorate, they were like, oh, you're going to go into academia, you're going to do this, or you're going to write a book and all of these things. And what they did is they wanted to change it up a little bit. And so they created an art show and a discussion around their work that is astounding and deeply intimate and deeply personal. But it's this other way of presenting their scholarship.
Yeah.
That makes it so much more, like, I've seen it probably 4 or 5 times, and it it wrecks me every time, right?
Well, it's another mode of being connected to people.
Right.
But if I went and did an artistic presentation of myself, not that it wouldn't be lovely, and not that it wouldn't be valuable or important, but it would be valued.
Right, exactly. The prestige piece that you, and that's what they're struggling with, is like, they're trying to figure out, like, okay, so I still also need to publish, and I still also need, like, they need a job, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And what does that look like for someone who wants to problematize a little bit the production model of the academy and the capitalistic systems and the oppressive systems and the ways in which certain things are prioritized, race and gender and stuff. So I think it's a very interesting question. And I think we could get into it for hours again.
I think so too.
We've been talking now for a little while, and I want to let you get back to, I saw your husband sneaking through there.
Yeah, did you? I thought I heard him, but I didn't see him.
Which is lovely. Like, I actually don't think I've ever met him in person. I've only heard wonderful stories and got
despite him irritating me when he lounges, he's quite lovely.
So I just want to say thank you very much, Natalie. I really appreciate your time, and I personally appreciate your scholarship. Everything that I see from you just like makes me stop for a minute.
I also want to reciprocate that I learned so much from you so regularly, and you remind me of what's important and how much I really appreciate that. Oh,
well, thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time, and please give my best to your family in this time. And I just love you tons, and I can't wait to see what comes next.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Hello there, everybody. This is Fred, the producer and editor of the show. I hope you enjoyed this month's episode. If you would like to hear an extended version, there's a full hour-long episode from this interview, which you can access on our Patreon page. You can also access this episode 1 week before it goes public on our Patreon as well, if you would like to support us there. And if you're not able to do so, that is totally okay, of course. We would appreciate if you would share this episode with your friends. If you learned anything or just enjoyed yourself, We are having a great time putting this show out for you, and we just wanted to remind you that during the coronavirus pandemic, we will be filming these episodes over Zoom, so the quality might not be as pristine as you may be used to if you've listened to this podcast for a little bit. But, we're just trying to make things work out, and we hope you still enjoy the show.